The Jackal, the boy wonder of the Bronze Age of comics, Gerry Conway was a fascinating guy. How can you describe a person who did so much and was so important and a pillar, a legend of the comics world, but also a person who left an indelible mark everywhere, even in the movies he was part of as a writer, the TV shows, the series, animation, all he did it all. He did so many things that it would take forever to really discuss his accomplishments, his life, also his criticism, the things that he was criticized for and the things that he was critical about too. To understand Conway, we need to go back to his beginnings. We need to go back to the starting point. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, in September 10, 1952, to an Irish family. He was the grandchild of Irish immigrants. He grew up, of course, in a blue-collar family in a neighborhood predominantly Jewish. So there were not that many Irish during that time or Italians in Brooklyn. So, he grew up in a very, very different time. His parents couldn't afford much. They were hardworking people. So comics was the place to escape. He understood from an early age that he was good at storytelling. He was part of the Boy Scout, and in one of those gatherings of Boy Scouts and camping, they went, of course, into around the fire. They were sharing spooky stories. So that when his turn came, he was probably around 11 or 12 or so, or probably even younger than that. So he started coming up with a story, and he was building that story as he was going along, and everybody was into it. Now, on the way back to camp, the scoutmaster pulled him aside and says, "Hey, you're very good at this. You're a natural storyteller. You need to look into it." So that started something in him to realize that was his call. He loved to create stories. He loved to do those things. And little by little, back in those years, of course, in the 60s, it was a very different time where children could do a lot of different things. He was sending letters to comic book companies, just sending them to publishers to say, "Hey, these are my stories if you can sell." He was going knocking door to door, dropping things. One thing that he mentioned that really helped him a lot is that because since he was young, he looked older than what he was. He was already taller. The companies were in a way brand new. DC was more established. Marvel was probably not even 10 years old, probably less than that. And there were other publishers, Charleston Comics. There were so many others that were producing so many things. So he was sending stories left and right, denied time and time again, but he kept trying and trying and trying. And he was finally able to sell his first story when he was 16 years old. Although in reality, he was only 15. He was about to be 16, but he was able to sell the first story. And when he did that, that prompted more little stories with Marvel, with DC. The short stories help him in the process of being able to be a better narrator. How to start a story, how to end the story, only when 7 pages. Particularly in a time where publishers were trying to find ways to save money by reducing the number of pages, when they reduce it from 22 to 20 and so on. And of course, they got the big spreads in the front, which is a way to technically pay less for it. And artists had to get paid less because now you have to do one spread, which technically is 1 page. But that's the way they cut corners. So in order to create those little stories, you have to be good at it. He said that being able to do those short stories allow him to be able to be better and faster in the writing and being able to be more concise and bring everything into a conclusion by the end. But the first story that he was able to produce fully was in 1971, which was a fantastic year for him because that's when he started doing Daredevil. Daredevil became his first story, issue 71, and he was taking over after Stan Lee. At this point, Stan Lee is moving away from writing. At that point, Stan Lee was doing a lot of the writing for a lot of the major stories and major comics that they were producing. There were not that many anyway, but they were producing that, and he was writing. But he has his eyes set to become a publisher, to be more of a who he was known for at the end of his life as a spokesperson and a publisher. So Roy Thomas, who was working for him at that time as an assistant, became in a way the editor, but he was also writing a lot of the stories. But it was a lot to do. It was a lot of writing. So in a way, he started relegating some of the lesser comic books that were not as popular. Daredevil, unfortunately, was not as popular as others. And in a way, Roy Thomas became a mentor, a big mentor of Gerry Conway for a long time. They were good friends. He even followed him when he moved to DC in the mid 70s. He followed him there, but they were always good friends. 1971 became an important year for Conway. He started writing those stories, of course, with Daredevil and Gene Colan. And there were other artists too, but Gene Colan definitely was the one that was the most important during that particular period that he wrote there. He also started writing stories for Iron Man with Don Heck. He was working with George Tosca, Herr Trimple doing that. And even though Iron Man is not necessarily considered his best time or his best run, you gotta see that that particular time that he was started writing for Iron Man, the stories that he created there were so important in the development of the character as we know in modern times. Definitely set the foundation that made Iron Man a more interesting character for sure. And of course, the Mighty Thor was another one that he started running, and he did that for a long time, particularly with John Buscema, also Sal Buscema, but particularly John Buscema, the phenomenal John. They did amazing work together. He technically followed after Stan Lee writing. He was taking over that time. Another opportunity came there to do it, and he did it for a very long time, doing stories with the Incredible Hulk during that year, 1971, with Herr Trimple. Also introduced Carol Danvers, Mrs. Marvel there, which was fascinating. Even though he only did the 3 issues, the first 2, the third one was he was technically plotting that. But Mrs. Marvel was another important character that he introduced, something that you will see in the life of Conway, how he, over time, over the years, he would always push for strong female characters. During his tenure with Daredevil, you saw Daredevil moving to San Francisco, finishing his relationship with Karen Page, which technically disappeared. Karen Page disappeared for a long time. She was in a time for a little while. She was partaking, she was a character in Ghost Rider, but she did not come back until Frank Miller. He brought Natasha Romanoff as is known now, but Romanova, that's how it was known then, the Black Widow. She became a big part also of Daredevil as a love interest, very strong character, and it was an interesting time. In a way, a lot of times people criticize him for taking Daredevil from New York to San Francisco, but to me that was actually not a bad time. It allowed for the character to grow and to be more mature, more self-assured, and more interesting in a way. And of course, Gene Colan loved it because Gene Colan loved the noir environments and all, and being able to do all that in San Francisco, which is a lot of movies, the noir movies were there. Gene Colan was a fan of those movies. He loved the idea, and definitely the art during that time was fantastic. But the writing, of course, and the combination in that made the stories shine to me. Another thing Gerry did, and he was very young, we're talking about he was 18, 19 years old when this happened. With the Tomb of Dracula, he's the one, with Gene Colan again, who introduced the comic book, issue 1, issue 2, 1972, but also he was involved in the Dracula Lives, which was between 1973 all the way to 1975. Marvel Spotlight, he was there, of course, with Mike Pluck. He introduced Werewolf by Night. On issue 2, issue 4, he was involved with that. Savage Tales, that's another one that he was so important to. He was writing then, and of course he introduced Man-Thing on issue number 1 with Roy Thomas, Stan Lee, and artist Gray Morrow. Now, the interesting thing about this is that he was a friend of Len Wein during that time, of course, because he was very young, 18 years old. He left home. His parents didn't approve much of what he was doing, and he was very strong-willed, so he decided to go move on with some of these artists, and Len Wein was his roommate for a long time. The interesting thing about that is that Len Wein, of course, as we know, he created Swamp Thing, and at the same time, it's always been the who created what was created first, and if both of them collaborated and created the same character in a way. But they're always gonna deny it. They always say that, but they were actually roommates. Of course, Len Wein created Swamp Thing, and of course, Gerry Conway created Man-Thing. And they say that it was an accident, but honestly, maybe there was a lot of collaboration. The world will never know for sure. The most impactful, the most important of the Marvel era that people will always remember him for is going to be The Amazing Spider-Man. Of course, at that time, he was 19 years old. This is 1972. The year after, of course, 1971, it was a fantastic year where he did a lot of stuff. In 1972, it's a period where he was so busy writing stories here and there. He was ambitious. He wanted to create stories. But The Amazing Spider-Man started in a process that definitely became impactful for Marvel Comics. And in a way, a lot of people consider that was the jump. Of course, particularly the death of Gwen Stacy, or the night that Gwen Stacy dies, that a lot of people consider that the jump between the Silver Age and the Bronze Age. Other factors occurred during that time. Other comic book stories are important, but that was one that definitely also triggered a lot of people to move from stories that were more, lighthearted to stories that were more deeper in connotation. Of course, during that tenure, he started working, of course, with John Romita, who is an amazing artist, one of the best artists, if not the best artist of, if you can consider for a lot of people, of Spider-Man, but also Gil Kane, who participated in the death of Gwen Stacy, but also you got Gene Colan. But the collaboration that was the most important during that period was with Russ Andrew. Now, Russ Andrew is definitely an unsung hero of the comic book industry. A giant that until now most people don't talk much about him, but honestly he's such an impactful person, and his collaboration, the chemistry that he had with Gerry Conway was fantastic. Of course, Russ Andrew, a master of perspective, a master of city landscape. He was perfection when he came to do those things. At his work, the beauty of it, the composition, the angular imaging, he was a great storyteller from panel to panel. So he worked so good with Gerry Conway during that period of time. Another person that I would compare that would be Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, who was on the DC side. Conway always praised both as his most fantastic collaborators because they actually were. During those 3 years, I'm telling you, 3 years, of course, we saw issue 121, the death of Gwen Stacy. Even though this was a decision that was taken, editorial decision that was taken not only by him, Roy Thomas was involved as the editor, but also Stan Lee. Stan Lee was involved. He accepted it. He let it go. He was more interested in being a publisher than anything else. But when the blowback came, he was not ready for it. So he kind of washes his hands and he put it on the editor and the writer. And that was something that was funny. But honestly, the thing about this is that Conway was firm about his decision of taking out. He cared about MJ. And I think, honestly, I grew up in the era in the 80s where that's when I started reading comics throughout the 80s. MJ was the person that we care about. And of course, Gwen Stacy was always in the back of their minds, in the distant memory through the old comics that we read. But to me, MJ was MJ. And to be honest, we cannot really see Peter Parker without MJ. Yes, Gwen Stacy was an important part of it, but really continued the trend, as he mentioned it, that, Peter Parker always loses, everything. And in a way, he's a loser, and didn't make sense the person that always is losing wins something like this, or a relationship. But as you know, Peter Parker became Spider-Man not because of he wanted to do the right thing as Captain America. He became Spider-Man because he was full of guilt, and guilt is a motivator in the character, and it's always been. Every character has its own drama. But besides getting rid of Gwen, he also introduced many characters during this time. Of course, you have Hammerhead, you have Jackal, you have the Punisher. Of course, the Punisher has become such an important character, and he was very outspoken in recent years about people taking over the symbol of the Punisher, particularly people in the military or, people in the police forces, as a way to represent, justice. Although, he made it very clear that the Punisher, when he introduced the character, was never a good guy. He was never meant to be a good guy. He was a guy that was in all the wrong. In a way, he was a villain, not even an anti-hero. He was a guy that he was motivated by revenge, pure revenge, and killing other people without due process. It was all about doing that. He never intended for him to be a good guy. And of course, evolved over time, and he became the anti-hero by other writers during the 80s and so, which saw the popularity. That's when we saw much of the popularity of Punisher that keep pushing through the 90s, and still the Punisher is famous today. But that was not his vision. For him, Punisher was more an establishment, a guy that came from Vietnam, a guy that technically didn't like the government, was against the government. He was Antifa all along. And I know people don't want to hear that expression or that word, but that is the reality. He was anti-fascist, but not in the best way. And of course, when he said that, it took a lot of flack. A lot of people came in his attack. There were so many videos right now. A lot of people calling him woke writer, this and that and that. But to be honest with you, it's so funny when people say that. calling him a woke person, because if you really know the story of Conway and the writers around him and his friends, the people he hang out with, they were progressives. In Marvel Comics was always progressive, even in a time of there were a lot of anti-war sentiment in the 1970s and the time that he was writing the stories. There was a lot of, you really read the comics, you're gonna see a lot of those parts where they showcase that sentiment of anti-war. These are hippies, hippies in the 70s writing stories that are changing the landscape of comics. This is not the Golden Age or the Silver Age. This is the Bronze Age. And he was a pillar of the Bronze Age. And the characters that we read now, all that can take away from the stuff that he was doing during that particular period of time. Of course, Harry Osborn, during his tenure, takes the mantle of the Green Goblin. Ben Reilly, first appearance, of course, because of the clone thing. So all that stuff, of course, that they pushed for the Clone Wars, there were a lot of things that happened afterwards because of that. Things that he was not against. Of course, during his time, we got the Spider-Mobile, but that was not his idea. That was actually Stan's idea, believe it or not. And he just had to go with it because he was just a kid, and he was getting paid for doing the job. I told him, you got to do this, so he did it. Not something that he approved. He also did the Fantastic Four. It was an interesting time when he was doing the Fantastic Four, really right after Stan Lee too. Started in 1973. He was working with some of the best artists, of course, and the art is, I think, the outstanding part of it. John Buscema, Joe Sinnott, Ross Andrew, Rich Buckler. You also have Ron Wilson, who I always love his work too. But this were the artists that he was working with. Then of course he started doing the Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, which I love always. And he worked initially at the beginning of the story, and then after he went to DC and came back, he started working with it again. He worked for a good amount of years on that series. Also, when he came back after DC, also he started doing the Web of Spider-Man, and he was working with Alex Saviek during the particular time. But when he was working with Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, he worked with Sal Buscema. If I make a list of all the artists that he ever worked with, I will never be able to stop. He worked with so many artists across the board. Of course, when Roy Thomas left to DC, he thought that he would become the editor. He wanted to be the editor-in-chief. But even they call him editor-in-chief, but there was only one editor at that time. Now of course there's so many different imprints and comics they have multiple editors, but at that time there was only an editor. And when he wasn't given the job, of course he was desensitized. He left and he went to DC. Now this period of time is also important for horror stories. Of course, the House of Secrets, House of Mystery. He was already doing stuff before even working with Marvel, so he already had a relationship with people there. He already knew people there, and some of the people that left during that time from Marvel went to DC. And then of course, he was familiar with them. Many of them, of course, work across the aisles, if you call it that, with both companies across the street. During that period, he started doing a lot of stuff for Action Comics, Adventure Comics. During that period, he worked a lot with George Tosca, Kurt Swan. He did a lot of work with him with Superman. All-Star Comics. It's a very important time because when he did All-Star Comics with Rick Estrada, Wally Wood, also he worked with Keith Giffen during that, I think, an issue or two. But this is the introduction of another important character. And again, it's something that we know about him is like he loved strong female characters. You have Power Girl, first appearance. Of course, the character developed buzz larger and larger over time, something that he didn't envision, but artists were doing, and that became part of the gig in a way of this character, the interest of this girl, the sexualized aspect of it, that of course, other writers over time have used to their advantage, but at the same time have created better storylines for her, and now it's just an important character, not only because of the attributes, but because of who she is. But also the introduction of Firestorm, the nuclear man. He did this with Al Milgram, and Firestorm became so important. Of course, you saw him and the Super Friends. It was an important character there, but he was the one who introduced the character, created the character. Of course, he tied with Justice League. He did a lot of work, a lot of different issues over time. Particularly, he had a lengthy run between issue 151 all the way to issue 255. That was one of the lengthiest runs forever. A lot of people love his stuff with the Justice League, also because he worked with some of the best artists of DC during that period. You have Dick Dillon, Rick Buckler, Dick Giordano, Don Hegg, George Perez. When he was technically working, started to do a lot of work with Justice League. He was doing a lot of stuff with him. Also Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, he did a lot of stuff. Again, Superman, a lot of work. And I think the best collaboration he did with Superman, besides of course Kurt Swan, was Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. Garcia Lopez was, again, as I mentioned about the similarities with Ross Andru, another unsung hero, and a guy that did so many covers. So many of the amazing covers you can think of DC during that time came from him. Another important and lengthy run was Wonder Woman. Technically, he started working in 1977, and last issue that he ever did was in 1986. But he worked with Don Heck, Joe Delbo. They worked together for a long time. Vince Coletta. They did also, he was an inker for the most part, but he also did some panels and stuff here and there. But I'm telling you, the collaboration, and of course, these are just names that come to mind, but there were more than them. There were a lot more artists throughout all the different runs that he ever did. He worked almost with everybody, with Jack Kirby. Another highlight in the career of Conway was the fact that he was one of the forefathers of the crossover events. He was with other guys involved too, artists and writers. They were playing along. Of course, you're talking about the time in the early 70s when they were working for both companies. They were already playing and kind of planting those seeds through different stories where you see a parade of Avengers or Marvel characters, and in the background you see Superman. It was just a gag that we're doing, but they're pushing towards that crossover event. And the first crossover event that is known for, the one that is recognized as the official one, of course, Superman versus Spider-Man, which was a big thing. At the beginning, Stan Lee wasn't a fan of the idea, but then of course he was sold the idea, because at that point, of course, everybody knew Superman. People did not know, besides of course comic book writers, Spider-Man that well. So definitely that was it was a way to promote Spider-Man, put him in the same level of Superman, which it really sold a lot of copies. But this was a great event, of course. That phenomenal cover art, it's amazing. Of course, the layouts there. It was Carmine Infantino who did the layouts, but it was Ross Andru who did, of course, the pencils and did all the ink, the pretty much everything, the embellishing of the art. He technically is mostly Ross Andru there. And if I'm not mistaken, also Dick Giordano was involved. But this was also followed by other big events, even within DC. You have Superman versus Wonder Woman, 1978. The art by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, amazing cover. You also Superman versus Shazam, that's 1978. You have Rich Buckler and Dick Giordano, and many other things that he did during that period. Of course, World Finest Comics, Detective Comics. That's another stink that he did with Batman stuff for a long time. He introduced so many characters, so many storylines. Killer Croc was introduced, one of the important villains nowadays. He was introduced issue 523 of Detective Comics. You also have the stuff that he did within Batman. Of course, it lengthy run 1978, 1983, but also you have Jason Todd was introduced in issue 357. But he worked with so many artists through Batman stories. You're talking about Don Newton, Gene Colan, Klaus Janson, Alfredo Alcalá, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, Jim Aparo, Dan Jurgens, and the beginning of Dan Jurgens' career, Dick Giordano, and so on and so on. So many artists that worked during that period. And of course, after things got the DC implosion, all of that, things had to restart again. He went back to Marvel and he continues his work over there. But at some point, of course, you have to think that he was also diving into other areas, particularly in film. He was writing and creating stories. He was working alongside Roy Thomas, selling some scripts for movies. The one that is most impactful, of course, is Fire and Ice, the animated 1983 classic film by Ralph Bakshi and Frank Frazetta. The second movie that he's known for is Conan the Destroyer, which is the sequel to the first Conan movie, 1984 movie. He wrote it with Roy Thomas too. But also he had a lot of credit doing animation. He did a lot of episodes for G.I. Joe, Real American Hero, Transformers, The Centurions, even My Little Pony, Dino Saucers. He did one episode there, but one of my favorite animated series from the 80s. Dino Riders too. He did another one episode there. He did 2 episodes of Batman the Animated Series. He also was involved, I think, 1 episode of the Spider-Man the Animated Series. So he was also writing animation. And on TV, I think it's where he went the most heavily. You have the stories from that time. You had the Father Dowling mysteries, which I didn't really watch. He did Perry Mason, a lot of the different movies for Perry Mason on TV, which I always love. I always love Perry Mason. Matlock, he did a lot of episodes for Matlock. He also did Diagnosis Murder, which is amazing to me because I've watched this with my wife many times, and I never really pay attention to that until now, really, that he was actually writing a lot of those episodes. Hercules, the legendary journeys with the actor Kevin Sorbo. Although I'm not necessarily a fan of Kevin political things nowadays, but I did like the TV show back in the day. Law and Order and Law and Order Criminal Intent. He did some episodes there. And The Huntress, another TV series that I enjoy a lot when it came out in the early 2000s, and so on and so on. He got a lot of credits for a lot of different TV shows, TV series over time, a lot of different episodes, and a lot of comic books that he came back and did with other publishers too, independent publishers over time. Now, honestly, I can go on and on, and I definitely took a lot of time here on this video to pay my respect to the memory, what I consider one of the most important writers of comic books of all time. But one thing I would say about this guy, who was like many of us, a fan of comics, a kid that started very young, and that he followed his dream, and the dream of many of us is to write a story or to write stories for comic books. But he did, and he was given the opportunity that many did not have. He pursued that dream and curated some of the most important key moments in a lot of the hero stories that we know, a lot of these characters that we love so dearly, and changed them forever. Without him, there will be no modern times. Yes, he was in later times in his life, he was more a believer that comics needed to stay politically aware, because that's what he was. Understanding that also they set culture, they follow culture, and they speak to culture in a way that people need to hear, and young people need to hear. They need to feel validated too of their opinions too, in a world that is constantly holding on to past ideologies. I feel that is the richness of what he did. He never backed down. People ask him, do you feel remorse to killing Wednesday? He never did. He said, no, I didn't. I did what I thought was right, and I thought it really gave the character of Spider-Man its own growth space, to mature. That allowed for MJ to grow also as a character, and even Gwen Stacy, because Gwen Stacy in the end was brought back. Spider-Gwen now, it's a great character in her own right. There's a different universe, yes, but it's a more important character that she was originally. And I feel that every the thing that he did, every seed that he planted, in a way brought fruit. Perhaps not right away, but over time. And many writers, many storytellers inspire themselves by this kid, but a kid that believed in those stories, and he wanted to express messages that were valid for the time and that were so important for the Bronze Age and the transition between the Silver Age to the Bronze Age. So yeah, I pay my respects to him, to his family. Thank you for allowing us to be part of his life, and thank him for always have that, the vision to understand characters in a way that other people didn't. And one thing I would say, that the reason why he understood those emotional parts of characters, even with Thor, when you look back at Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, it's all about the God story. When he took over that in Thor, it became the human story. It's a god who's also a man. And I think he mentioned in an interview the fact that he was able to understand that alongside John Buscema, because they were both, of course, Catholic. John was Italian, of course he was Irish. They grew up and were raised Catholic, so they understood the implication of a god man. So that really kind of gave Thor a more natural feel, felt more down to earth. And yes, John loved to do the space soap opera thing with his art, but being able to have it more grounded really paved the way for other characters down the road, for other artists and writers, like, of course, the Walt Simonson, to do an amazing run in the 80s because of the way the character was paved. So, when you look at that, even the stories that I didn't care much about it, back in the day as a kid, that the stories that he wrote, now in hindsight, when I look back in the years and I'm older, I can see how those decisions that he made affected those characters in a way that changed them forever and allow other artists to expand in those ideas in a deeper way. All those things definitely was because he had the desire and the ambition to change the stories and to make it more believable, to more relatable to the youth, to people who felt, okay, this is the real life, there are real consequences. So for that reason alone, he deserves to be honored. So I honor the memory of the great Gerry Conway today through this video. So my friends, what do you think about Gerry Conway? What do you think about his legacy, his contribution to comics? Are you a fan of his work? You're not a fan? What do you think about his political views? Of course, he was always political. He was political on X, on Twitter. He always expressed his disdain for a lot of the political figures that we have today. But that is the thing that made him so special. But he was a very articulated man when he expressed things out. And when you hear him talk, I invite you to go through the YouTube, through the videos and interviews. You'll see that he's a man full of richness and someone that is always a pleasure to hear talk. So my friends, thank you very much. And again, Godspeed to one of the greatest. Thank you, Gerry Conway, for everything you did. So my friends, God bless you. Take care. I'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.